Lisa, you and I have chatted several times about mobility rights and some of the infringements that we have seen happen on those charter protected rights since COVID began, since these measures were brought in place. Do you feel what happened with the Mathises is an infringement on mobility rights?
Oh, I think it is, certainly. I mean, we have the right as Canadians to freely enter our country and to leave it. And so on the face of it, it is very much a violation of Section 6 of the Charter. The question is it justified under Section 1? And that's what all of these infringements come down to.
KR, you were a former police officer yourself. You're now an attorney. I got a little nervous when I heard Nikki explain her story of how, she came off the flight and then, after a couple of checkpoints, if you will, there was a host of police officers waiting to take her potentially, to either a quarantine facility or into custody if she refused to comply. Is that allowed?
Well, under the order in council that was released, it appears that it is. I think, there's legal issues that are in play. Number one, this is issued under an order in council. This is not a piece of, this is under the Quarantine Act, but it's not a regulation under the Quarantine Act. It's sort of akin to what you would have as an executive order from the President of the United States. The question is, why are these major issues not being debated in the legislature? Why is this just being enacted by an order in council when we're taking a look at something that has a wide swath of affecting rights of Canadians?
And, I'm perhaps like Nikki in some capacity, that I could have very easily been in her shoes. She read everything she had to prior to boarding that flight. It wasn't in America. It was an American Airlines flight, and she got what she thought was the right test. She got a negative COVID test. She was let through by the American Airlines, gate staff, boarded the flight, and then, she had all of this to experience when she landed. Lisa, for me, I feel like things are just not being communicated clearly, and I would be just as equally confused had I been in Nikki's shoes. Is there a responsibility on that traveler to know every aspect of what's required, and where does one go to find this information? What's the onus and the burden of information that has to be placed on this person, this traveler?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. It's impossible for the average citizen to know what they're supposed to do and not do. The media hasn't necessarily made this all very clear ahead of time. For most of us, it was a shock. Even us lawyers working in this area and dealing with constitutional freedoms, we didn't know about this until Nikki's story came to light. And then there were a couple of other stories to follow. So it's very hard for people to stay on top of all of these orders. And as KR says, they're not happening with notice in the legislature where there's a full debate and everybody can know what's coming. These are ministerial orders being made by cabinet members without fanfare often, and just released to the public. So, or at least released on their website. So yeah, it's very difficult for the average person to know what they're supposed to do. Now they have made it clear, but unfortunately not in time for some families.
And Lisa, just as a follow-up, this is a federal order in council. This is not provincial. So even though the health jurisdiction falls generally under a provincial mandate, and the airport was in Calgary, it is still federal jurisdiction. So an order in council federally has to be implemented even though it's provincially. Is that correct?
Well, the federal jurisdiction over airlines is applicable here, and also the Quarantine Act is a federal piece of legislation. So under both aviation and quarantine laws are federal. So healthcare and other things that have been impacting us more dramatically day to day have been under provincial jurisdiction. All of those restrictions that we have on our comings and goings, but these particular pieces of legislation are federal.
And KR, again, I'm still shocked by the police presence at the airport, that, you could be greeted by police before, if you don't have the right kind of negative test. Is that allowed? Is that their right to do that? And is there anything a citizen can do?
Well, the Quarantine Act permits that. And I think that this is the question that people have to ask themselves. We're looking for further restrictions, but when it actually affects you personally, are you willing to be arrested? Are you willing to be detained by the police? This is what happens when these regulations come into play, and you have to ask, should there be greater scrutiny when that is being offered up?